And then Luke gives them four most beautiful words, I think almost in all of his gospel. Four little words that today I got to thinking for Marion would make a really wonderful eulogy for her. Because then Luke says, when Jesus saw her, not the dead man. He'd seen hundreds of dead people going to be buried. But this day it stopped him in his tracks. What was most beautiful about it is that even though this woman was breaking the traditions and the laws, Jesus welcomed it. He says, you are rewarded because you got guts, lady. Because you stood up. Because you didn't go weeping and crying in a corner, but you took on life and said, this is my son, and I'm going to make this journey. And Luke says, when Jesus saw her, and he saw her because she was walking at the back, doing this most difficult journey that she really didn't have to do, but there she was. And as I looked at all those pictures, all through Marion's life, and then I heard about her losing a son also, and I'm sure many other difficult things in her life. But all through her life, and the laughter and all the good memories that are in here, and there will be many more, I kept thinking of those four words, and what an appropriate eulogy today for Marion. To simply say, when Jesus saw her, in difficult times, in funny times, in good times, saying goodbye to her first husband, and marrying Pete, and all of the things that were a part of her life. She really was right there. That's one thing I really picked up. And something Carol said that was really good, so I'm going to tell a quick story, because Italians, they love stories. And Carol had been saying, you know, you said at the end, we're going to have something special at the end, at the very, very end, before we go eat, but we'll save that especially. Because Carol said, we want this all to end upbeat. Well, I think the whole thing can be upbeat, actually. I don't think we have to wait till the end of a service like this. We're celebrating Marion's life, her new life and everything. But as I heard about the things that I did hear about in Marion's life, I pictured her as the kind of woman that maybe, especially in later life, didn't take a lot of guff off people and stuff. And she could stand her ground and you know, be a little cantankerous in there. Well, this is a story of a woman like Mary. And this, if you ever go up to Chicago or Detroit, I studied up in Chicago. I used to love to get in the car. I was in a monastery there, but to go and drive through the old neighborhoods. And in these old neighborhoods, the old neighborhoods, like Archie Bunker type stuff, it was just like that, the old, you know, narrow little row houses. But about every 2 blocks there was a church. Everywhere. These little churches, everywhere you looked. And it was really interesting that when, after World War I, and as people moved into these neighborhoods, as things started building up, that people would come in and build their houses, but then they'd always make sure they had their church there where they could worship. And a lot of these churches, this is the sad part now, were Catholic. I say sad because they'd be 2 blocks apart. But God forbid that the Irish Catholics should worship with the, Polish Catholics. And there were a lot of priests back then, so they just all came in and built their things. Well, this is the story of one of those little churches. It was built a long time ago on a corner. And next to this church was an empty lot. And the people in this little parish hoped that someday they might be able to build something there. Maybe a little parish hall or a school. But times got rough. And when you drive through those neighborhoods now, you see a lot of closed down little churches and stuff. And things got really tough. People moved out of the neighborhood. The bishop had to send in a poor old retired Monsignor just to keep the place going. And it was really in bad shape. But there was a woman in this parish. She lived just up the street. And all of her life she'd been in the habit of coming to daily mass, and she'd walk the 3 blocks to the church, but she'd have to pass in front of that empty lot. And by now the lot was overgrown with weeds. People had thrown trash in. It really looked bad. So one Sunday after Mass, when the old Monsignor was standing on the steps, greeting what little flock he had left, she came up to him. She said, "Monsignor, you know the lot next to the church?" He says, "It looks so terrible." She says, would you mind if I took it on myself to clean it up a little bit? The old Monsignor just chuckled. He looked around. He says, look at this place. It's a dump. He says, I don't know what good that would do. And she says, well, it won't cost you anything. I just want to volunteer my time. He says, fine, fine. He says, you've got my blessing, but I really don't expect too much. So she went to work, and every day when she came to Mass, she started with a wagon. She started hauling garbage and weeds out, and she cultivated the ground and dug it up, and it took a long time, but soon the whole lot was covered in green grass. It was looking beautiful. She got to thinking, as she looked one day along the sidewalk, if she just planted a little flower bed there, the whole length of the sidewalk, maybe that would keep people from throwing their trash in there in the future. So she bought a few little petunias, some cheap flowers. She dug a flower bed the whole length of the sidewalk, and she planted those flowers with love. And one day she was out there weeding the flowers. She was kneeling on the hard sidewalk and bent over, pulling the weeds out when the old Monsignor came along. And he saw her kneeling there, and he walked up behind her. And then he looked up at the lot. Green and beautiful. It was like a park. And he looked down at the wonderful woman, and he said, well, my daughter, you have done a marvelous job here. With the help of God. The old lady looked up from the hard cement, hands covered in dirt. She looked at the Monsignor. She says, ah, yes, Monsignor. But do you happen to remember what it looked like when God was on his own? And I heard all these things about Mary, and I kept thinking, I like short eulogies. That took a long story to tell a short eulogy, but I think it would be a good eulogy today, from what I heard, to say that Marian never left God on his own. And in good times and in bad, in tough times, in fun times, in up times and down times in her life, that was a part of her life, was her faith and her orneriness and her love and her commitment to her family and the food and the fun and all the other F's that go with good Italians. It was all part of her life. And so I think today, she's looking at a magnificent screen. Probably had to bring in extra screens just to put all the good pictures on it for Marian. And she's there with several other people who were important in her life. We're not going to the cemetery today. But the first prayer that we would pray, I gave Carol a copy of this. As we gathered around the place of burial, the church is very wise. In a very subtle way, it always knows that's the most difficult time, because then you have to leave that cemetery. So the very first words we would pray, so we'll pray them now. They're not so much a prayer, but a reflection. And this is what we would say. We would stand at the graveside and say, our sister Marian has gone to her rest in the peace of Christ. May the Lord now welcome her to the table of God's children in heaven. It's a feast. It's a table. It's a meal. Just like we'll be sharing together after this. It's a wonderful vision. And a good vision to leave all of in our minds today as we remember this very good woman. We wanted to be sure if there was anyone who wanted to share any stories or anything about Marian and her life. Please feel free to do that. I'm just going to start with a little something here, because this came from Teresa Denning. And then you'll see how easy it is to stand up here and just talk and do this. You'll come up. But Carol asked me to read this. And Teresa is a friend.
She was like a cousin to me.
Oh, like a cousin. Okay. To Carol. And she lives in Seattle, could not be here. She writes, our hearts are broken, yet full of the memories of your mom, made for us. I was so mad when I found out she wasn't really my aunt. She was always that, and so much more to us. We all long for the bright red lipstick prints on our cheeks. Thanks for sharing her with us. And God bless you all.